The night Sela's work came to Cora Bellamy's door. The wind off the quartz road was the kind that killed men, and he came to her with nothing left to bargain with but his own life. I know that for a fact because I'd driven my freight wagon over that same stretch not an hour ahead of him, and I'd near frozen to the seat doing it. A man rode behind me somewhere in that white howling dark, afoot now and not knowing it, and I never saw him. Cora did. Cora was the only soul on the whole quartz road who opened a door that night, and what came of it I have told at 100 campfires since, because it is the truest thing I know about what one small kindness can do when it is given for nothing. I was a saproot then, freighter, and I am a saproot now, old, and I have hauled goods and gossip up and down that road for the better part of 30 years. So I knew Antler Flat before Cora ever came to it, and I knew it after, and I can tell you there was never a poorer, harder, more forgotten little crossing in all the territory. It sat where the quartz road bent around a shoulder of bald rock and dropped toward Bellwether, a half-day's haul on. There was a low sodden timber house there with a lean-to barn, a well that froze solid 4 months of the year, and a wooden sign her husband had burned with a running iron before he died. MEALS. That was all. MEALS. A man could get a plate of something hot and a corner of the floor to sleep on, and that was the whole of the trade. Tom Bellamy built that place dreaming of a town that never grew, and then a horse rolled on him in the spring of his 3rd year there and left Cora a widow at 26 with a debt at the Bellwether Bank and a kitchen at the end of nowhere. Folks said she'd go back east. Folks were wrong. She stayed. She stayed 3 winters running, and by the 3rd she was thin as a fence rail and stubborn as the rock the road bent around, and she fed every drifter and freighter and broken-down cowhand who came through, whether or not he could pay, which mostly he couldn't. I used to tell her she'd starve herself feeding the territory. She'd set a plate in front of me and say, "A man on this road is a man between 2 cold places, Asa. I won't send him out hungry to the second one." And that was Cora. She had a way of saying a plain thing so it stayed with you. So you have to understand what she had that winter, which was near nothing, before you understand what she did. It had been a killing season. The snows came early and stayed mean. The freight slowed to a crawl and then near stopped, and a way station lives on the road, and when the road dies the station dies with it. Cora's larder by January was down to a sack of beans gone half to weevil, a little salt pork she was rationing in slivers, a crock of lard, and flour enough for maybe a week of bread if she stretched it. The bank in Bellwether held the note on the place, and a clerk named Harlan Pine had ridden out twice already that winter, picking his teeth and looking at her sign and her well and her thin face, and telling her the bank could not carry a dead account forever. She owed $200 and could not have laid her hands on 20. That was the woman, and that was the night. She told me later it was full dark and the wind was throwing snow flat against the one window when she heard the dog. She kept an old yellow hound named Biscuit, half blind and good for nothing but warning, and Biscuit set up a low, worried sound he saved for living things. Then a hand fell against the door, not a knock, a fall, the way a man leans when his legs have quit. She lifted the bar. He came in with the storm and went down on the floor in front of her hearth before he'd got 3 steps. He was a big man under the rime of snow, dark-bearded, dressed for hard travel but dressed wrong for that cold, his good coat gone somewhere, his hat gone, one glove gone, and the bare hand had gone the gray-white of a hand that is freezing in earnest. He had no horse, she heard no horse, and there was none in the yard come morning. He had no saddlebags, no rifle, no bedroll. He had nothing. He had walked into her door out of a country that killed men for less, and he carried not one thing of value that she could see. She did not stop to wonder who he was or whether he could pay. She has told me since that the thought never crossed her mind that whole long night, and I believe her, because it never would have. She dragged him by the collar nearer the fire, a slight woman hauling a big freezing man across a dirt floor by main stubbornness, and she got his frozen boots off and his frozen hand into a basin of snow melt that she warmed by slow degrees the way you have to, Never quick, never to the fire direct, or the flesh dies in the thawing. She'd nursed frostbite before. She knew the trick of it. He came around enough to shake and to know where he was, and the shaking is a good sign. It's the men who stop shaking you bury. She wrapped him in the quilt off her own bed, the only quilt she had, and she put the last of the morning's coffee, grounds twice boiled already, back on to warm, because warm is warm. And then she did the thing this whole story turns on, and she did it without a flicker. She had been saving a loaf, one loaf. She'd baked it that morning out of the bottom of the flour sack, and it was meant to be her bread for 3 days, broken small, because there was no more flour coming until the road opened and no money to buy it if it did. It sat wrapped in a cloth on the shelf, the last bread between her and a week of thin bean water. She took it down, and she cut it, and she warmed the slices on the hearthstone with a smear of the lard, and she fed the stranger her 3 days of bread, one slow piece at a time while he got his wits back, the way you'd feed a sick child. He tried, somewhere in there, to say something about paying. She told me his first whole sentence, once he could make one, was a hoarse, "Ma'am, I can't pay you tonight, but I'll." And she said, "I didn't ask you." That was the whole of it. "I didn't ask you." She told him to hush and eat, and he ate her last loaf, and he had no idea on this earth that it was her last, and she never told him. That is the part I always come to and have to stop on. She never told him. A lesser soul lets a man know the size of the gift while he takes it. Cora let him think it was nothing so he could take it clean. He slept by her fire that night, and she sat up in the cold dark away from it, wrapped in a horse blanket from the barn, feeding the flame chip by chip so it wouldn't die on him, and she did not sleep at all. Now I have to tell you about him, the way it came clear to me later, because in the morning he was just a beat-down stranger and neither of us knew different. His name, the part of it he gave, was Silas. He didn't give the rest, not for a good while, and I'll come to why. He was a cattleman, that much a body could read off him once he was warm and upright, in the way he stood and looked at stock and weather, the easy bow-legged set of a man who'd spent his life a horse. But he came to that door with the look of a man who had lost everything in the space of an afternoon, and as near as I ever pieced it together, he just about had. He'd been 3 days east, doing business in the cattle towns, carrying money, a good deal of money, the season's sale in a money belt and a fat pocketbook, headed home over the quartz road like a fool because it was the short way and he was in a hurry to be home. 2 men took him on the open road below the bald rock. They knew he'd be carrying. They took the belt and the book and his rifle and his good coat and his horse and his saddle and left him afoot in the failing light with the storm coming on, and they took it for granted the storm would do the rest and there'd be no one left to talk. It very nearly worked. A man afoot in that wind, robbed of his coat, has maybe 2 hours. Silas had walked better than 2, hunting any light at all, and the only light in 20 miles of dark was Cora Bellamy's one window with the fire behind it. So that was the truth of the man she fed her last bread to. But she didn't know it, and he didn't tell it, and here is the thing about Silas' work that I came to admire. A proud man, robbed and beaten and brought to a stranger's floor on his hands and knees, will most often lie himself bigger. Silas did the opposite. He'd been a rich man so long he was sick to the back teeth of folk who were kind to his money and cold to him. So when this thin widow at the end of the world hauled him off her floor and fed him her bread and didn't ask his name or his business or his means, he made up his mind, lying there warming, that he would not tell her one word of who he was. He wanted, just once, to be helped as a man worth nothing, and to see what a person did with that. He found out what Cora Bellamy did with it. The storm shut the road 3 more days. There was no leaving, and in those 3 days the man got his strength back and got a look at how things stood, and it shamed him to the bone, though he hid it well. He saw the weevily beans. He saw her cut the salt pork in slivers thin as a knife is wide. He saw the flour sack standing empty and the bread shelf bare, because she'd given him the last of it, and he was cattleman enough to do that arithmetic. He saw her feed Biscuit a little of her own plate and eat the less for it. He saw the bank clerk's 2 trips written in the worry that lived between her eyebrows even when her face was easy. And he saw that she did not complain of any of it, not once, not to him, a stranger eating her out of what little house she had. So he started to work. He couldn't pay, he had not a coin, and he wouldn't say why, and she didn't press. But a frontier man pays what he can with what he's got, and what Silas had was a strong back and a lifetime of knowing how to do hard things right. He mended the linta where the wind came through and was killing what little warmth the stock made. He rehung the barn door so it didn't bind. He broke the ice on the well every morning before she woke, so the first thing she found on rising was water already drawn. He split a winter's wood out of a deadfall behind the rock that she'd never had the strength to drag in. He cleaned the chimney that had been smoking her out for a year. He found 100 broken small things a place like that grows, and he fixed them, quietly, never making a show, and at night he'd sit across her fire and they'd talk a little, careful, 2 private people. And the careful talk got less careful by slow degrees the way ice goes off a window. You don't see it move, but come noon you can see through. I rolled in on the 4th day, road just barely open, half my own goods iced to the wagon bed, and I'll tell you I stopped short in that yard, because there was a strange big man up on Cora's roof patching the sod where it had blown bare, working like the place was his own, and there was smoke coming clean and white out of a chimney that used to smoke black, and the well lid was off and a full bucket standing, and the whole sorry little crossing looked, for the first time in 3 winters, like somebody was keeping it. "A saproot," Cora said, coming out wiping her hands, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen since Tom died, not happiness exactly. She was too worn for that, but a kind of company in it. "You'll stop and eat." "I always stop and eat," I said. "Who's your roofer?" "A traveler," she said. "Caught in the storm. He's working off his board." And she said it plain, but she didn't quite meet my eye when she said working off his board, because we both knew there was no board to work off when there was no food to speak of, and what he was really doing was trying to put back into that place some part of what she'd given him for nothing. The man came down off the roof and put out a cold hand and said, "Silas," and nothing more, and looked at me steady the way a man does when he's decided to be no more than his first name to the world for a while. I'd freighted long enough to know better than to ask a man on that road for the rest of it. We shook. He had a grip like a snubbing post. We ate beans and the heel of nothing much, and I noticed he took the smallest portion at that table and pushed a slice of his own onto Cora's plate when he thought neither of us saw, and she pushed it back, and there was a whole conversation in it that neither of them said out loud. I pulled out at dusk for bellwether, and I remember thinking, hauling away, that whoever Silas was, he'd come to the one door on the quartz road where being nobody was no count against him. I didn't yet know how much that would come to mean. The thaw broke the week after. It always comes sudden in that country, a warm wind out of the south, the eaves running, the road turning to a misery of mud you'd almost rather have the snow back for. And with the thaw, Silas had no more reason to stay. He was strong again. The road was open. A man's got business in the world, and Cora knew it, and she didn't say a word to keep him, because keeping a man wasn't in her. She set him up a little packet of food for the road out of what she didn't have, and that near broke me when I heard it later. She sent the man who'd eaten her last loaf off down the road with a packet of food, because that was the only way she knew to say a thing she'd never say out loud. He stood in the yard with the wind running warm and the mud sucking at his boots, and he looked at her a long moment, and Cora has told me what he said, because she kept it the way you keep a thing you take out and look at on bad nights. He said, "I owe you my life, ma'am, and I mean to pay it. You won't believe that standing here looking at me, but you'll see." And she said, because she was Cora, "You don't owe me anything, a man between 2 cold places. I'd do it again tomorrow." "I know you would," he said. "That's the why of it." And he went. He walked off down the quartz road toward Bellwether with a packet of a poor woman's food in his coat. He'd taken her dead husband's old coat. the only one in the house, and she'd made him take it. And he'd taken it because to refuse would have been a worse thing than to accept. And Cora stood in the yard until the bend by the bald rock took him. And then she went in and barred her door and was a woman alone at the end of the road again, with weevily beans and a bank note and a name she'd carry, which was Sela's, and no more than that. She figured she'd never see him again. Most you never do. The road takes them, and that's the end of the story for the one who stayed behind. She'd given a stranger her last bread and her dead husband's coat and 3 days of her 3 days' food, and she'd gotten in trade a mended roof and a winter's wood and the memory of a careful voice across her fire. And she told herself hard that it was a fair enough trade and she'd not be foolish enough to want more. Now I'll tell you the part Silas told me himself, years on, sitting on a good porch with a good cigar, when he could finally laugh at it, though it didn't laugh easy. He walked into Bellwether 2 days after, mud to the knee, in a dead man's coat, with no money, no horse, and no name he was giving out, and the first soul who recognized him near fell off the boardwalk. Because Silas Rourke was not a small man in that country. Silas Rourke owned the Larkspur outfit, the biggest cattle range in 3 counties, better than 40,000 acres of grass running up the Larkspur Basin, more cattle than a man could count in a week, riders on his payroll, the whole concern that half the town of Bellwether made its living off of one way or another. He'd been given up for dead. They'd found his horse run off and recovered, and a torn-up patch of road, and feared the worst, and there was already low talk about what become of the Larkspur with the old man gone. For he was the last of the Rourkes, no wife, no child, his people all in the ground. And here he came walking up the muddy street alive, in a stranger's coat, and the whole town swarmed him, and he held up a hand and got quiet and asked one question first, before he'd answer a single one of theirs. He asked who held the note on a way station at Antler Flat, a widow's place, a woman named Bellamy. That was the first thing the richest man in 3 counties asked, walked back from the dead. The bank held it, they told him. Harlan Pine's bank, $200 and about to be called. I happened to be in Bellwether that very afternoon, my wagon at the freight dock, and I saw the whole of what came next, and it is the best afternoon of business I have witnessed in 30 years on that road. Silas Rourke walked into that bank still in the dead man's coat with the mud drying on him, and he did not raise his voice, which somehow made it worse for Harlan Pine. He laid it out plain. He bought the widow Bellamy's note off the bank entire, then and there, and tore it across the middle in front of the clerk, and told him the place at Antler Flat was clear and free and would stay clear and free, and that if any man from that bank ever rode out to Antler Flat again picking his teeth and worrying that thin woman about a debt, that man would answer to Silas Rourke personally. And the way he said personally, Harlan Pine went the color of paste. Then Silas paid out for a fresh horse and a wagon and the best of every kind of provision the Bellwether store could load, and he hired 4 of his own Larkspur riders to drive it, and he turned the whole train around and pointed it back up the quartz road toward Antler Flat. And that is how Cora Bellamy came to look up from her dooryard on a bright mud-running morning and see the road full of riders coming for her. She told me her heart went to ice when she saw them. A woman alone, 4 mounted men and a loaded wagon coming up her road hard. She did not think rescue, she thought trouble, the way a body who's known mostly trouble will. She put Biscuit behind her and stood in her own door with her dead husband's old shotgun, the one that didn't shoot true, and she watched them come. Then she saw the man riding the head of them, on a fine horse now, in clean clothes now, sitting easy and tall the way a man sits who is home in his own country, and it was Silas. It was the careful voice from across her fire, and she could not make it fit, the stranger she'd fed her last loaf to riding up her road like a king, and she stood there holding a gun that wouldn't shoot, not understanding, while the man swung down out of the saddle in her muddy yard. "Ma'am," he said, and then because the moment wanted the truth, he gave her the rest of his name at last. "Cora, my name's Silas Rourke, I own the Larkspur up the basin. I'd have told you only, and here the big man stopped and looked at the ground a second and went on. Only I wanted just one time in my life to be helped by somebody who didn't know it. And you did. You fed me your last bread. Don't tell me it wasn't your last. I counted the sack. You gave me a dead man's coat. And you never once let me feel the size of it. I have been rich a long while, Cora, and I never in my life had a gift given me that clean. She did not say anything. She couldn't, she told me. She was a woman who'd held herself together by main strength for 3 winters, and the bottom had just gone out of it all at once. Your note's torn up, Silas said. Bought it off the bank. The place is yours clear. That wagon's got flour and pork and coffee and sugar and seed and a milk cow tied on behind. That's not charity, that's a man squaring a life he owes. And these 4'll have your barn put right and your fences up by dark, and then they'll go home and they won't trouble you. He took off his hat. But I'll be coming back myself with your leave, not with a wagon, just me. Because the truth is I've thought about your fire every night since I left it, and not on account of the warm. And there it is. There's the whole turn of it, said in a muddy yard by a man with his hat off. Now I want to set something straight, because the way the tale gets told around the campfires, it goes soft and easy from here. The rich man rides up and saves the poor widow and they're wed by spring. And that's not how Cora was, and it's not how it went, and the truth of it is better. Cora Bellamy did not fall into Silas Rourke's arms because he was rich. If anything, the riches near ruined it. She'd taken him in when he was nobody, and the wagon and the riders and the torn-up note frightened her worse than the bank ever had, because she could not abide the thought of being a thing a rich man fixed. She told him so that first day, standing in the mud, told him she'd not be paid for a kindness, that the minute kindness had a price on it, it stopped being kindness and started being trade, and she'd not have her one clean thing turned into trade. She told him to take his wagon back. And Silas Rourke, and this is why I came to love the man, Silas heard her. He didn't bluster and he didn't go cold. He stood there and he took it, and then he said the right thing, which was, then keep the place clear because the note was a wrong thing a small man held over you, and let me square that for my own conscience's sake. But the rest of it, the coming back, that's not paying you. That's me wanting to. Those are 2 different wagons, Cora, and I'll send the one home this minute if you'll let me drive the other. She let the riders mend her barn. There's no fool pride in a sound barn before another winter. The milk cow she kept and named her, which is how I knew it had taken. But she would not touch the fine provisions until she'd worked it square in her own head, and the way she worked it square was she fed every soul that came up the quartz road that whole next year on Silas Rourke's flour, free, the way she always had, so that it wasn't his gift to her sitting in her larder, it was his gift to the whole road passing through her hands. That was Cora. She found a way to take it that kept her clean, and Silas saw what she'd done with it, and I am told he had to go out to the barn a minute. He came back, like he said, not with a wagon, just him on his own horse, with the dead man's old coat folded clean and returned and a new one of his own on his back, and he'd sit across her fire of an evening and they'd talk, the careful talk gone careless now, and he courted that woman slow and honest through a whole turn of the seasons, the way you gentle a horse that been used hard and had a right to its suspicion. He never crowded her. He let her be the one to close the distance, inch by her own inch, because he understood that a woman who'd held her own ground 3 winters running was not a woman to be carried off her feet. She was a woman to be stood beside until she decided you could stay. I carried more than freight up that road that year. I carried word mostly, how the Larkspur man kept riding out to Antler Flat, how the widow's place was painted now and the well had a good cover, and there was a second chair by the fire that stayed. The town made what it makes of such things. Some said she'd schemed it, the clever widow snaring the rich old bachelor. The ones who said it had never met Cora Bellamy, who'd have given her last loaf to the devil himself if he'd come cold to her door, and who turned the man's fortune around and fed it to strangers rather than let it make her soft. And some said he was a fool, a man of his standing taking up with a way-station widow who had nothing. Those hadn't met Silas, who'd been rich and lonesome his whole life long and knew to the penny what nothing and everything were worth, and had found the one person in the territory who'd treated him like a man when he was worth, on paper, exactly nothing at all. They were married in the fall, a year and some after the storm, in the little church at Bellwether, and it was the gladdest poor-and-rich wedding that country ever saw, half the pews full of larkspur riders in their stiff best, and the other half full of freighters and drifters and broke-down cowhands who'd eaten free at Antler Flat and come to see the woman who'd fed them get her good day. I stood up in it. Silas asked me to, on account of I was the first man besides her to shake his hand when he was nobody, and I have not been prouder of a thing in my life. She did not stop keeping the place. That surprised the town and didn't surprise me one bit. She could have moved up to the big Larkspur house and never broken ice on a well again, and Silas would have given her that and counted himself lucky. But Cora kept Antler Flat going. They ran it together now, and the riders rotated through, and the sign still said MEALS in Tom Bellamy's old burned letters, and any man between two cold places still got a hot plate and a corner of the floor, only now the larder never ran low. She used to say she'd not turn her back on the only thing that ever mattered she did. And Silas, who could have bought her 100 finer things, understood that the way station was her finest thing, and he kept it standing for her sake, and the two of them grew old at that bend in the road keeping the door that she had kept alone. I'll tell you the last of it and then I'm done, because it's the part I save. Years on, they were both gray by then, and the road had grown a proper little town around the crossing, and Antler Flat had a real inn where the sod house used to be, though they kept the old burned MEALS sign hung in the doorway out of pure stubborn memory. I was passing through, old myself, and I sat at their table one night the way I had 10,000 times, and I asked Silas the thing I'd never quite asked. I asked him, with all his 40,000 acres and his cattle past counting, what he reckoned was the richest he'd ever been. And he didn't say a word about the Larkspur. He looked across the table at Cora, who was getting up to fix a plate for some half-froze drifter who'd just come in off the road same as he had once, and he said, "The night I had nothing, Asa. The night a woman fed me her last loaf and never let me know it was her last. I was the richest man on this earth that night and didn't have the sense to know it. Took me near losing everything to find out what a thing was worth." Cora heard him. She didn't turn around. She just set the plate down in front of that stranger and said, "Eat. You don't owe me anything," and went on about her work. I have hauled freight up and down the Quartz Road for the better part of 30 years, and I have seen gold come over it, and seen men kill for less than was in Silas Rourke's money belt the night it was took off him. But the richest thing I ever saw move on that road was a poor widow's last loaf of bread, given to a freezing stranger for nothing, asking nothing, and the long way it traveled, and everything it brought home.